The Tower of Fire, the day the sky fell. Prologue, the Reign of Bodies. March 25, 1911, 4:45 p.m., Greenwich Village, New York City. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The air was crisp, hinting at spring. In Washington Square Park, strollers were walking their dogs, and students from New York University were enjoying the sunset. Suddenly, a sound cut through the city noise. Sirens. Horse-drawn fire engines thundered down the cobblestones of Green Street. A crowd began to gather at the corner of Green and Washington Place. They looked up. The Ash Building was a 10-story skyscraper, a marvel of modern fireproof construction. But smoke was pouring out of the 8th, 9th, and 10th floors. Then the crowd saw something on the ledge of the 9th floor. It looked like a bundle of cloth. It was dark and fluttering in the wind. It hesitated for a moment, then fell. It didn't drift like fabric. It plummeted like a stone. It hit the concrete pavement with a sound that those present would never forget. A wet, heavy, final thud. It wasn't a bundle of cloth. It was a girl. Then came another, and another, and two more holding hands. The firemen raised their ladders, but the ladders only reached the 6th floor. The water hoses couldn't reach the 9th. The safety nets held by desperate men tore apart like wet tissue paper when the bodies hit them. For 15 minutes, it rained young women in New York City. They were the shirtwaist makers. They were the daughters of Italy and Russia. They were the future of America. And they were burning alive in a fireproof building. This is the story of how they got there, why the doors were locked, and how their deaths gave birth to the modern workers' rights movement. Chapter 1. The Golden Door, 1909, Ellis Island, New York City. To understand the tragedy, you must understand the victims. They came through the Golden Door. They were mostly Jewish girls fleeing the pogroms of Russia, or Italian girls escaping the poverty of Sicily. They were young, most between 14 and 23 years old. They arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a fierce desire to work. New York City in the early 1900s was a city of extremes. The Vanderbilts and Rockefellers lived in palaces on Fifth Avenue, while the immigrants lived in the squalor of the Lower East Side tenements. The tenements were dark, airless, and crowded. A family of 8 might live in a 2-room apartment. Tuberculosis was rampant. But for girls like Clara Lemlich and Rosie Friedman, America was still the land of opportunity. They didn't want charity. They wanted jobs. They found work in the garment district. The fashion trend of the era was the shirtwaist, a high-necked, puffy-sleeved blouse modeled after the Gibson girl look. Every woman in America wanted one. And the kings of the shirtwaist were 2 men, Max Blank and Isaac Harris. Chapter 2. The Shirtwaist Kings. Blank and Harris were the American dream personified. They were Russian immigrants who had started with nothing and built an empire. They owned the Triangle Waist Company. Their factory was located on the top 3 floors, 8th, 9th, and 10th, of the Ash Building. It was a modern factory. It had high ceilings, big windows, and electricity. It was considered a model shop. But beneath the surface, it was a prison. Blank and Harris were obsessed with theft. They believed the girls were stealing scraps of fabric and lace in their purses. To prevent this, they designed a brutal system: the doors. There were two exits from the factory floor, one onto Green Street and one onto Washington Place. The owners kept the Washington Place door locked from the outside. The checkpoint, at the end of every day, all 500 workers had to leave through the single Green Street exit. There, a guard would inspect their purses. It created a bottleneck. But Blank and Harris didn't care about safety. They cared about fabric scraps. They also hated unions. They hired thugs and prostitutes to beat up any girl who dared to talk about organizing a strike. They were the shirtwaist kings, and they ruled their factory like a kingdom. Chapter 3. The Uprising of the 20,000. November 1909. Before the fire, there was the fight. The conditions in the factories were unbearable. The girls worked 14-hour days, 6 days a week, for about $6, equivalent to $150 today. They were charged for the needles they broke. They were charged for the electricity they used. If they were late, they were locked out for half the day. Tension boiled over at a mass meeting at Cooper Union. The male union leaders were speaking cautiously, telling the women to be patient. Suddenly, a tiny teenager stood up. It was Clara Lemlich. She had been beaten by police days earlier. Her ribs were broken. She walked to the podium. She spoke in Yiddish. "I have listened to all the speakers, and I have no further patience for talk. I am a working girl, one of those striking against intolerable conditions. I move that we go on a general strike." The room exploded. The crowd rose to its feet. They took a solemn oath. The next morning, 20,000 women walked off the job. It was the largest strike by women in American history. They marched in the snow. They were arrested. They were beaten by the police. The wealthy women of New York, the Mink Brigade, joined them, bailing them out of jail. Blank and Harris were terrified. They formed an association of owners to crush the strike. But eventually, most factories caved and recognized the union. Most, except the Triangle Waste Company. Blank and Harris refused to give in. They offered higher wages and shorter hours, but they refused to unlock the doors or allow a union on safety inspections. The girls returned to work at Triangle in 1910. They had won more money, but they had lost the battle for safety. They went back into the locked cage. Chapter 4. The Spark. March 25, 1911, 4:40 p.m. It was closing time. On the 8th floor, the cutters were cleaning up. The floor was covered in scraps, highly flammable pieces of cotton and tissue paper. The bins under the tables were overflowing with 2 months' worth of cuttings. The Triangle factory was a fire trap waiting to happen. The floors were soaked in machine oil. The wicker baskets were full of fabric. The patterns hung from the ceiling on wires. There were no sprinklers. The only fire escape was a flimsy, rusted iron structure on the back wall that ended in a courtyard, not the ground. At 4:40 p.m., a cutter, likely smoking a cigarette, though it was never proven, dropped a match or a butt into a scrap bin under table 2 on the 8th floor. Whoosh! Cotton is explosive. The fire jumped from the bin to the patterns hanging above. In seconds, the ceiling was on fire. "Fire!" someone screamed. Max Rother, a supervisor, grabbed the fire hose. He turned the valve. Nothing came out. The water pressure had been disconnected. The fire spread instantly to the 9th and 10th floors through the open windows and the air shafts. Chapter 5. The 8th Floor Panic. On the 8th floor, chaos erupted. 200 workers scrambled for the exit. The main exit was wide enough for only one person at a time because of the theft inspection partition. The girls smashed through the partition. They poured into the staircase and ran down to the street. Most of the workers on the 8th floor survived. They were close to the ground and the fire started there, so they saw it first. On the 10th floor, the executives, Blank and Harris, were alerted by a phone call. They took their families onto the roof. From there, students from the university law school next door lowered ladders and saved them. The owners survived unharmed, but no one called the 9th floor. Chapter 6. The Trapped Ninth. 4:45 p.m. The 9th floor. There were 250 workers on the 9th floor. Sewing machine operators, young girls. They didn't know there was a fire until the flames were licking out the windows. Suddenly, smoke billowed up the stairs. The girls jumped up from their machines. "The stairs!" someone shouted. They ran to the Green Street staircase. It was already blocked by a wall of fire coming up from the 8th floor. They ran to the elevators. There were 2 freight elevators. The operators, Joseph Zito and Gaspar Mortallalo, were heroes. They drove their cars up into the inferno. The girls pressed against the elevator doors. When the doors opened, they piled in, crushing each other. Zito took a load down. He came back up. The heat was cracking the glass of the elevator shaft. He took another load. On the 3rd trip, the girls didn't wait for the car. They jumped into the empty shaft. They landed on top of the elevator car. The impact bent the steel roof. The blood dripped down onto the survivors inside. Zito couldn't go up again. The elevator jammed. That left the fire escape and the Washington Place door. Chapter 7. The Collapse. A group of girls ran to the rear window. They climbed onto the iron fire escape. It was flimsy. It was meant for maintenance, not for hundreds of panicked people. As they crowded onto it, the heat of the fire melted the bolts anchoring it to the brick wall. With a terrifying metallic scream, the fire escape detached from the building. 20 girls fell 100 feet into the concrete courtyard. They were impaled on the iron spikes of a fence below. The escape route was gone. Inside, the fire was consuming the room. The air was turning into poison gas. The girls were hair on fire, dresses on fire. They ran to the Washington Place door. The door that Blank and Harris kept locked to prevent theft. They pounded on it. They screamed, "Open! Open the door!" But the manager with the key had already fled. They were trapped against the wood. The fire was behind them. The locked door was in front of them. Chapter 8. The Windows. 4:50 p.m. There was only one place left to go. The windows. The crowd on the street below watched in horror. They saw the faces of the girls pressed against the glass. Then the windows shattered from the heat. Margaret Schwartz was 24 years old. She was with her friend Jacob Bernstein. "The fire is coming," she whispered. "My dress is burning." Jacob tried to put it out, but the flames were too strong. He pushed her toward the window, and then he scrambled out himself, sliding down the elevator cable. He looked back. He saw Margaret fall back into the fire. At the other windows, the girls made a choice: burn to death or jump. They began to climb onto the ledge. A reporter, William Shepard, was watching from the street. He later wrote, "I learned a new sound that day. It was the sound of a living body hitting a stone sidewalk. Thud, dead, thud, dead, thud, dead. 62 thud deads. I call them that because the sound and the thought of death came to me each time at the same instant." The firemen raised their ladders. The ladders only reached the 6th floor. The girls on the 9th floor looked at the ladders, realized they were useless, and jumped anyway. They aimed for the fire nets. The nets broke immediately. The bodies smashed through the canvas and hit the pavement, sometimes 3 or 4 at a time. One couple, a young man and a woman, stood on the ledge. They kissed. Then he held her out and dropped her. Then he jumped after her. Within 18 minutes, it was over. The fire had burned itself out. 146 people were dead. 123 of them were women and girls. The youngest was 14. Chapter 9. The Morgue on the Pier. March 26, 1911. The city was in shock. The bodies were taken to the Misery Lane Pier, the Charity Pier, on the East River because the city morgue was too small. Thousands of families lined up. It was a parade of grief. They walked down the rows of open coffins. The bodies were charred. Some were identified only by a ring or a dental filling or a braided piece of hair. "My daughter!" a mother screamed, collapsing onto a blackened box. 7 bodies were never identified. They were burned beyond recognition. New York didn't just mourn, it raged. The headlines screamed, "Murdered by greed. Locked doors deal death." Chapter 10. The Trial of the Kings. December 1911. Max Blank and Isaac Harris were charged with manslaughter. The prosecution's case hinged on one fact: the locked door. If the door was locked, they were guilty. If it was open, it was just a tragedy. The courtroom was packed with the survivors. They were scarred, traumatized, and angry. The star witness was Kate Alterman. She had been at the Washington Place door. "I tried the door," she testified, weeping. "I pushed it. I pulled it. It would not move. It was locked. I saw Margaret Schwartz die right there because she couldn't get out." It seemed like an open and shut case. But Blank and Harris hired the best lawyer in New York, Max Steuer. Steuer was a genius of cross-examination. He didn't attack Kate's story. He attacked her memory. He asked her to repeat her story. She did. He asked her to repeat it again. She did, using exactly the same words. He asked her again. Same words. Steuer turned to the jury. "She has memorized this," he argued. "She was coached by the prosecution. She is reciting a script." He confused the jury. He planted doubt. He argued that maybe the door was locked, but maybe Blank and Harris didn't know it was locked at that specific moment. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. The verdict: not guilty. Blank and Harris walked free. They exited the courthouse through a private door to avoid the mob of angry families waiting to lynch them. They collected $60,000 in insurance money, roughly $400 for each dead worker. They made a profit on the fire. A year later, Blank was arrested again for locking the doors of his new factory. He was fined $20. Chapter 11. The Woman Who Wouldn't Cry. April 2nd, 1911. The Metropolitan Opera House. The legal system had failed, but the people would not. A massive memorial meeting was held. The elite of New York were there. They made speeches about charity and sorrow. Then a small, red-haired woman walked to the stage. It was Rose Schneiderman, a labor union leader. She looked at the wealthy citizens in their furs and suits. She didn't cry. She shouted, "I would be a traitor to these poor burned bodies if I came here to talk good fellowship. We have tried you, good people of the public, and we have found you wanting. The old Inquisition had its rack and its thumbscrew and its instruments of torture with iron teeth. We know what these things are today. The iron teeth are our necessities. The thumbscrews are the high-powered and swift machinery close to which we must work, and the rack is here in the fire trap structures that will destroy us the minute they catch on fire." Her words hit the room like a bomb. Chapter 12. The Commission. Rose Schneiderman's speech lit a different kind of fire. In Albany, the politicians realized they couldn't ignore this. 2 young politicians, Al Smith and Robert F. Wagner created the Factory Investigating Commission. They hired Frances Perkins, a young social worker who had witnessed the fire from the street. For 3 years, this commission tore through New York. They didn't just hold hearings, they raided factories. They crawled through smoke-filled basements. They climbed dangerous fire escapes. They forced factory owners to testify under oath. They found children working in darkness. They found chemicals stored next to heaters. They found locked doors everywhere. Between 1911 and 1914, thanks to the Triangle Fire, New York State passed 36 new labor laws. Mandatory fire sprinklers, outward opening doors so panic crowds wouldn't jam them shut, maximum occupancy limits, fire drills, limits on working hours for women and children. These laws became the model for the entire United States. They were the foundation of the New Deal. Frances Perkins, the woman watching the bodies fall, would go on to become the first female cabinet member in U.S. history, Secretary of Labor under FDR. She famously said that the New Deal began on March 25, 1911. The epilogue. The chalk marks. Present day. The Ash Building still stands in Greenwich Village. It is now the Brown Building, part of New York University. It is a National Historic Landmark. Every year, on March 25th, a ceremony is held. A bell tolls. The names of the 146 victims are read aloud. But the most haunting tribute happens on the sidewalk. Volunteers take chalk, simple white chalk, and go to the homes where the victims lived in the Lower East Side. They write the name of the girl, her age, and the words, "Died in the Triangle Fire." If you walk through the East Village in March, you will see them, the ghosts in the chalk. Rosie Friedman, 18. Yetta Griffith, 16. Sarah Kupla, 16. They didn't die in vain. Every time you see a fire exit sign, every time a door opens outward, every time a sprinkler system saves a building, you are being protected by the spirits of the girls who jumped from the 9th floor. They couldn't save themselves, but they saved us. The end.